"94 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Not cold, not extreme. A different category of reality entirely. At this temperature, the moisture in your breath doesn't steam. It crystallizes before it leaves your lips, falling to the ground as a whisper of ice. Metal doesn't bend. It shatters like porcelain. And timber, ancient, dense Siberian larch, doesn't creak. It screams, a sound locals call the singing of the trees, a sound that means the forest itself is breaking. This is Yakutia, a territory larger than India, swallowed by the eastern edge of Russia, where the city of Yakutsk holds a record no city on Earth wants, the coldest permanently inhabited place in human history. In January 1938, temperatures here plunged to minus 67.7 degrees Celsius. Not a brief dip, a season, a way of life. And yet, people didn't just survive here. They built homes, raised children, kept cattle alive, and did it for centuries, without glass, without steel, without insulation as we understand it today. So ask yourself this question, and hold it until the very end of this video. What does it say about us that the most sophisticated thermal survival machine ever conceived by human hands was built from mud, straw, and animal dung? Before a single post is driven into the ground, the Yakut builder reads the land, not with instruments, with memory, with a knowledge passed from father to son across generations of winters that killed the careless. The first rule is deceptively simple. Never warm the ground beneath you. Beneath the surface of Yakutia lies permafrost, ground that has been continuously frozen for thousands of years, in some places reaching depths of 1,500 meters. It is harder than concrete in winter, but introduce heat, the heat of a home, of cooking fires, of living bodies, and that concrete becomes mud, and mud swallows foundations whole. Modern engineers in Yakutsk are learning this lesson the hard way right now. As global temperatures rise, the permafrost beneath the city is destabilizing. Buildings constructed in the Soviet era, on deep concrete pilings, are tilting, cracking, collapsing. The infrastructure of the 20th century is losing a battle that the Yakuts solved with shallow wooden pads centuries ago. Their solution wasn't to fight the permafrost. It was to leave it undisturbed. The balagans sits on wide, flat wooden platforms, stacked like snowshoes, that distribute the structure's weight without piercing deep enough to transfer warmth downward. Beneath the floorboards, a deliberate cold crawl space is maintained, a pocket of frozen air that acts as a thermal firewall between the heat of life above and the ancient ice below. The site itself is chosen with the same precision. Not on an exposed hilltop where wind strips warmth in minutes. Not in a valley hollow where cold air pools and settles like water. Instead, sheltered within the taiga forest, where birch and larch break the wind. And always, without exception, the door faces south, toward the low winter sun, toward the only warmth the sky offers for months. The first decision isn't about wood or mud. It's about reading the land like a language you were born knowing, and understanding that the earth beneath your feet is not your foundation. It is your first and most dangerous enemy. Now the land has been read, the site is chosen. The cold crawl space is locked beneath the floor. But a house is only as strong as its bones. And in Yakutia, the bones of a building follow rules that modern structural engineers would recognize. Not because they learned from the Yakut, but because physics doesn't negotiate. It only rewards those who listen. The posts don't stand straight. This is the first thing a visitor notices about the balagan skeleton, and the first thing they misunderstand. The pillars lean inward, converging toward the roof like the walls of a truncated pyramid. To an untrained eye, it looks like imprecision, like a builder who didn't know how to use a plumb line. It is the opposite. When a Siberian storm hits a flat vertical wall, it doesn't just push, it grabs. The wind finds every edge, every corner, every flat plane, and applies force like a lever. But a sloped surface redirects that energy. The storm climbs the wall rather than striking it, its force converted into downward compression along the pillars, actually pressing the structure into the earth rather than tearing it away. Snow follows the same logic. The incline sheds it from the roof before weight accumulates to dangerous levels. But that same snow, once fallen, banks against the base of the walls, forming a dense, natural insulating skirt that seals every gap between the structure and the frozen ground. The storm builds its own weather stripping. In the 1960s, engineers developed a structural concept called tensegrity, the idea that a framework could achieve stability through a precise balance of tension and compression rather than rigid right angles. The Yakut had no name for it. They had something better. They had winters that killed every builder who got it wrong. Then comes the detail that stops every engineer who encounters it for the first time. There is not a single iron nail in the entire structure. At minus 70 degrees Celsius, iron becomes a liability on two fronts. First, metal conducts heat with brutal efficiency. Every nail becomes a tiny thermal bridge, a needle pulling warmth from inside to outside. Second, and more immediately dangerous, steel becomes brittle at extreme cold, losing up to 70% of its impact resistance. A structure held together by iron nails in a Yakutian winter is a structure waiting for the right storm to shake itself apart. Instead, every joint is cut as a wooden mortise and locked with birch pegs. Long timbers are bound with rawhide lashings, applied wet, while the hide is still pliable. As it dries, it shrinks, and as it shrinks, it generates a clamping force that, across an entire structure, amounts to thousands of pounds of binding tension. In a major storm, this frame doesn't resist. It flexes. It absorbs. It moves with the wind the way a tree does, rather than fighting it the way a wall does. Flexibility, here, is not weakness. It is the definition of strength. The skeleton is complete. The bones are set. But bones alone don't keep you alive. What comes next is the part of this machine that separates the balagan from every other cold weather shelter ever designed. And it is, on the surface, the least impressive ingredient imaginable: mud, straw, and the aged manure of cattle. The mixing begins in late summer, while the ground is still workable. Clay-rich soil is combined with chopped straw and fermented dung, water added gradually until the mixture reaches the consistency of thick paste. Every ingredient is load-bearing, not structurally, but thermally and biologically. The clay provides the matrix. Its microscopic plates interlock as they dry, forming a surface that is airtight but not impermeable, a distinction that will prove critical. The straw acts as an internal lattice, arresting microcracks before they can propagate through the wall. Without it, the dried clay would fracture under the violent temperature shifts of a Yakutian winter, expanding and contracting until gaps appeared, and gaps meant drafts, and drafts at minus 70 degrees Celsius meant death. The manure, the ingredient that makes modern sensibilities flinch, is perhaps the most sophisticated component of all. It contributes fine vegetable fibers that reinforce the matrix at a scale too small for straw to reach. But more remarkably, the organic compounds and natural enzymes present in aged dung maintain a degree of elasticity in the cured wall, allowing it to flex microscopically with temperature change rather than crack. Modern building science has a term for this property: hydrothermal regulation, the ability of a wall assembly to absorb, store, and release both heat and moisture in dynamic response to changing conditions. It took Western construction science until the late 20th century to understand and intentionally engineer this behavior. The Yakut encoded it into dirt. The first coat of mud is applied by hand, literally, fingers pressed into every seam where the floor meets the frame, hunting for voids that tools cannot feel. Every pinhole is a future draft. Every gap is a slow leak of warmth that compounds through a night of minus 60 degrees Celsius cold, until, by dawn, it has cost lives. The second coat builds the body of the wall, feathered wide, rounded at every external corner, so that wind finds no edge to catch. As autumn hardens into early winter, the first freeze completes what human hands began. The moisture within the mud crystallizes, vitrifying the exterior surface into a mineral glaze, a natural ceramic armor against wind and abrasion. Inside, the wall wakes up as something else entirely. During the day, when the stone stove burns, the thick mud absorbs surplus heat, storing it the way a battery stores current. At night, when the fire dies to embers and the outside temperature falls to its cruelest depth, the wall begins to release that stored warmth, not as a blast of hot air, as something quieter and more profound, a steady, invisible pressure against your skin. The sensation of a wall that is actively, slowly, giving you back what the day put into it, and it breathes. Because the organic fibers in the mud are hygroscopic, They attract and bind moisture molecules. The wall absorbs humidity from breath and cooking throughout the day. As vapor binds to the clay matrix, it releases a small but measurable pulse of exothermic heat, a whisper of warmth generated by the chemistry of moisture meeting Earth. At midnight, in the deepest cold, the walls themselves are heating the room. Press your palm against a cured balagan wall in January. You won't feel cold. You'll feel something older than memory, the mineral warmth of a decision made right, 500 years before the word insulation existed in any language. The walls are sealed, the bones hold, the mud breathes. But a survival machine that keeps you warm in total darkness is only half a machine. You still need light. And in a Yakutian winter, where the sun rises for perhaps 3 hours, a pale, exhausted arc that barely clears the tree line before retreating, light is not a comfort. It is a psychological lifeline. Glass, of course, is not an option. Even if it were available, glass at -70 degrees Celsius conducts cold with devastating efficiency. A glass window in a balagan wall would be a hole, a slow, invisible wound bleeding warmth into the night. So the Yakut went to the river. Not every section of river ice is equal. The builder looks for depth, layers formed in the earliest, coldest weeks of winter, before snow clouds the surface and air bubbles corrupt the crystal structure. These deep slabs are clear, dense, free of the fractures and inclusions that would scatter light unpredictably or compromise structural integrity. The blocks are cut, hauled back to the building site, and shaved with a bone or antler blade until they fit precisely into stepped wooden frames, notches cut into the wall structure weeks earlier, waiting for exactly this moment. The seal is made with slush mortar, snow and water mixed to a thick paste, packed into every gap, freezing within seconds into a crystalline gasket that tightens as temperatures drop further. The result is not a window in the modern sense. It doesn't offer a clear view of the outside world. It dissolves the outside world into light. The dense ice diffuses the low winter sun into a soft, ambient glow that spreads further and more evenly across the interior than glass ever could. There are no harsh shadows, no cold spots beneath the sill, just a quiet luminescence that fills the room like something breathing. On the coldest nights, a fine layer of frost blooms across the inner surface of the ice pane, a white garden of crystalline geometry that is, simultaneously, one of the most beautiful phenomena in human domestic life, and a functional insulating layer, slowing the escape of radiant heat from the room. Glass lets you see the world. Ice lets the world dissolve into light. In a Yakut winter, that diffused glow isn't just illumination. It's proof that morning came, that the machine held, that you are still alive to witness it. But light without breathable air is its own kind of death. The balagan's ventilation system is invisible to the eye, and critical to survival, and it operates on a principle that modern HVAC engineers would recognize immediately, even though the Yakut had no engineering language to describe it. The stack effect. Warm air is less dense than cold air. It rises. In the balagan, warm air naturally accumulates beneath the low ceiling and presses toward the single small vent box fitted at the crown of the roof, a wooden shutter controlled by a cord from the sleeping platform. As warm air exits through the top, it creates a pressure differential that draws a thin, controlled thread of fresh cold air inward through felt flaps installed near the floor, close to the stove, where incoming air is immediately warmed before it can chill the living space. This circulation serves 3 simultaneous purposes that cannot be separated without catastrophic consequence. It keeps the fire oxygenated. A stove starved of fresh air doesn't just burn poorly. It produces carbon monoxide, odorless, invisible. Historically, CO poisoning during severe winter storms, when ventilation was accidentally sealed by drifting snow, was among the most common causes of death in cold climate dwellings across northern cultures. The balagan's ventilation system was not a comfort feature. It was the difference between sleeping and not waking up. It exports peak humidity before moisture can saturate the roof timbers and freeze into structural rot. And it maintains the pressure gradient that allows the mud walls to exhale vapor outward, keeping the thermal battery dry, elastic, and functional. The system is tuned entirely by ear and sensation. A rush of sound at the crown vent means the shutter is too wide. Warmth is escaping faster than the stove can replace it. A heaviness in the air, a sullen quality to the fire's behavior, a subtle dimming of the flame. These are the signals that the inlet is partially blocked. that oxygen is thinning, that the balance has shifted toward danger. You adjust the shutter by a finger's width. You clear the exterior vent cap with a long pole kept beside the door, because snow accumulation on that cap, in a single bad storm, can seal the throat of the house and turn the interior into a slow gas chamber. They didn't control the air, they negotiated with it. And there is a lesson in that. One that extends far beyond the architecture of a mud-walled house in Siberia, about the difference between forcing a system into submission and learning, deeply and humbly, to work within its logic. When the balance is right, the balagans sounds alive, a faint crystalline tick from the ice panes as temperatures shift, the soft, steady exhale of warm air at the crown, the quiet heartbeat of the stove. The house isn't just sheltering life, it is breathing. Everything built so far, the floating foundation, the pyramidal frame, the breathing mud shell, the ice windows, the ventilation lung, all of it exists to serve one purpose: to keep a fire alive long enough to keep you alive. But in Yakutia, fire is not a luxury you throw wood at until you feel warm. Fire is a precision instrument, and the balagan is the machine built around it. Morning begins before the stove. It begins with your hand hovering over the ash bed, not touching, just feeling. Because at -70 degrees Celsius outside, the question that determines everything about your day, your survival, your family's safety, is not asked with words. Is there still an ember? A faint red answer in the gray ash means the house kept its promise through the night. It means the walls did their work. It means the thermal battery held its charge through the darkest, coldest hours, releasing just enough stored warmth to prevent the fire from dying entirely. If the ash is cold and black, you are not just relighting a fire. You are fighting for your life in a room that has already begun its descent toward ambient temperature, toward -70 Celsius, toward the end. This is why the Yakut don't think of the stove as a heater. They think of it as a heartbeat. And like a heartbeat, its rhythm must never be allowed to stop. The stove itself is in feat of thermal engineering, built from stone and packed earth. Its firebox is deliberately kept small, counterintuitively so, to a modern eye conditioned to think that bigger fires mean more warmth. But a large firebox burns hot and fast, sending the majority of its energy straight up the chimney as superheated exhaust. A small controlled firebox forces hot combustion gases to move slowly, snaking through channels packed into the earth and bricks surrounding the fire chamber, surrendering their calories to the thermal mass along every centimeter of that journey. By the time exhaust reaches the crown vent, it is measurably cool. The heat didn't escape. It stayed. It sank into the stone. And stone, once warm, gives back slowly, radiantly, for hours. Wood is the spark that wakes the system, but wood burns fast and bright and wasteful. The real fuel, the fuel that holds the house through the long midnight, is dung. Dried blocks of cattle dung, stacked in the firebox like careful architecture, small aisles left between them for airflow, smolder with a dense, steady intensity that wood cannot match. Not a blaze, a sustained, disciplined burn that plateaus and holds for hours without attention. Wood is the opening statement. Dung is the argument that lasts until morning. The stove face warms first, then the integrated stone benches built against it, then the mud walls that absorb the radiant output and begin their slow, silent work of storing it. This is radiant heat, fundamentally different from the forced air warmth of a modern furnace. It doesn't heat the air first and hope your body intercepts some of it. It travels directly from surface to surface, from wall to skin, warming your body without drying your lungs, without the drafts and cold spots that convective heating always creates. In the most brutal cold snaps, the weeks when even the Yakut acknowledge that the cold has become something beyond ordinary winter, the thermal baseline of the balagan is nudged upward by a source of heat that requires no wood, no fire, no management whatsoever: the cattle. Calves or sheep are brought into a partitioned bay directly adjacent to the living space, sharing a wall but maintaining a separate air path. A single adult cow generates approximately 1,000 BTU of heat per hour, equivalent to a small electric space heater running continuously, consuming nothing, requiring no fuel, needing only hay and water. Multiplied across 2 or 3 animals through a -60 degrees Celsius night, this biological contribution to the house's thermal budget is not trivial. The mud wall between the animal bay and the living space absorbs their warmth and adds it to its own stored charge. Even the diet is calculated into this system. High-fat broths, dense cuts of meat, foods that require the body's metabolic furnace to work at full capacity, generating internal heat that supplements the stove's output. The Yakut didn't just heat their homes, they heated themselves, from the inside out. Now step back. Look at what has been built, not as a collection of parts, but as a unified system. And understand that the construction of this system followed a calendar as precise and disciplined as the engineering itself. In spring, when rivers loosen and sap descends in the trees, larch and birch are harvested. Low sap content means tight, dense grain, wood that will resist the checking and splitting that moisture-rich timber suffers in extreme cold. Through early summer, the footprint is laid. Wooden pads distributed across the chosen site. Cold crawl space established. The skeleton rises through midsummer. Posts angled, joints pegged, rawhide lashings applied wet, and left to shrink into their final, immovable grip. Late summer is the season of mud. The mixture, prepared weeks earlier and left to ferment slightly, allowing the organic compounds in the manure to activate, is applied in 2 coats. First coat by hand, hunting every seam. Second coat by tool, building body and rounding corners. As autumn sharpens, hairline cracks are stitched with fine clay slip and straw. The first hard freeze of early winter completes the cure, vitrifying the surface into its final mineral state. And last, always last, when the river ice has reached its maximum thickness and clarity, the windows are set. Slabs quarried, shaped, sealed with slush mortar that freezes within moments into permanent, airtight crystal. By the time deep winter arrives and the temperature begins its descent toward its worst, the balagan is not a building under construction. It is a living system that has learned the winter. That has been tuned to it, layer by layer, season by season, until the cold itself becomes part of the machine's operating logic. Remove any single component, the vent, the mud skin, the ice pane, the rawhide joints, the livestock, the dung fuel, and the system begins to degrade. Not gracefully, fatally. This is not a house assembled from parts. This is an ecosystem, every element dependent on every other, the whole vastly more capable than any sum of its components could suggest. The frieze reads the year's work and approves. Step outside the balagan for a moment. Not literally. At minus 70 degrees Celsius, you would have approximately 4 minutes of exposed skin before frostbite became irreversible. But mentally, step back far enough to see what this structure actually represents. It is not a primitive shelter, not a relic of people who didn't know any better. It is a masterclass in a form of intelligence the modern world has largely abandoned, the intelligence of deep listening. Every decision in the balagan's design emerged not from calculation, but from consequence. Generations of builders who made mistakes paid with their lives. And the knowledge of what not to do, what gap not to leave, what material not to use, what direction not to face a door, was encoded not into textbooks, but into hands, into memory, into the instinct of a child watching a father work in the last weeks of summer before the cold returned. Modern construction science has spent decades slowly rediscovering what the Yakut already solved. Hydrothermal regulation, thermal mass design, passive stack ventilation, vapor open wall assemblies. We gave these things Latin names and published papers about them. The Yakut built them from dirt. There is something in that fact that should stop us. Not to romanticize hardship, but to recognize that embedded within what we dismiss as primitive technology is a depth of systems thinking, of ecological integration, of hard-won empirical knowledge, that our civilization, for all its sophistication, is only beginning to approach from the other direction. The balagan doesn't fight the winter. It recruits it. It turns the freeze into mineral stability, the snow into weather stripping, the permafrost into a foundation, the darkness into diffused light, and the base 70 degrees Celsius itself into the pressure that seals every gap in the mud shell. The environment that would kill you if you fought it becomes the thing that keeps you alive if you listen to it. And now, the question this video opened with: what does it say about us that the most sophisticated thermal survival machine ever conceived by human hands was built from mud, straw, and animal dung? It says this: that intelligence is not a function of the materials available to you. It is a function of how deeply you are willing to understand the problem. The Yakut had no steel, no glass, no synthetic insulation, no supply chains, no safety nets. They had a cold that killed without mercy, and a landscape that offered almost nothing. And from almost nothing, they built everything they needed. The mind, pressed hard enough against a real problem, with real consequences, over enough generations, converges on solutions that are not merely adequate. They are elegant. They are systems. They are alive. The balagan kept its promise for centuries. It exhaled through the crown. It saw through the ice. It held its mineral warmth through the longest nights in the inhabited world. And every morning, when a hand passed over the ash bed and found a faint red answer in the gray, it had kept its most fundamental promise of all, that the people inside were still alive to face another day. We live now in sealed boxes of concrete and glass, pumping heat from burning ancient carbon, and we call this progress. Perhaps it is, but we have traded something, a quality of attention, of presence, of intimate negotiation with the physical world, that the Yakut never surrendered. They never forgot that warmth was something you had to earn, and in their forgetting nothing, they remembered everything. Subscribe. Because the ancient world built solutions to problems we are only now learning to ask. Next, we go further north, further back, and further into the cold. The Vikings are waiting.